This very expansive lecture is going to cover early gaming before 1985, specifically looking at the three categories, beginning with the rise of Atari to become the juggernaut that it will be in the home console and arcade industry, then turning to the rise of PC gaming, which would challenge home consoles given their flexibility and their affordability as far as the games are concerned, and then finally turn to the golden age of arcades in the 1980s with all of the classics that we're familiar with. Picking up where we left off, Bushnell and Dabney are going to try to trademark their original name for their company that they had set up previously, Sigeny, but it was already taken as a trademark company. Instead, fortuitously, they decided to go for a term that was related to Go, the equivalent to check in chess. That term is Atari, almost synonymous with early gaming today. So Atari was founded in 1972 with both founders, Bushnell and Dabney, investing $250 each. One of the first moves that the partners made was to hire Al Alcorn, who was hired to create a simple ping pong game with two bats, a ball, and a score tracker. This game, of course, would become the most famous smash hit early on in arcades, mounted in a $75 black and white television screen and a 4-foot-tall cabinet. We find that Alcorn hardwired everything himself, making improvements upon Magnavox's Odyssey tennis game. Now, the Odyssey, if you remember, had very odd controllers and a limited range of angles of return to the ball as it went back and forth over the court. So what Alcorn did with Pong in 1972 is made many improvements upon this model. The bat, for instance, invisibly is divided into 8 vertical segments. The angle of return, depending upon what part of the bat it hit, would of course alter the trajectory of the ball. The effective illusion gives it the effect that we have a racket physics here taking place. Now the middle segments would return in a straight line. Next would return at a shallow angle if it hit at a side, and the outer edges would ensure that the ball flew off at a 45-degree angle, much more complex than Magnavox's version. The ball would then accelerate after a certain number of returns in order to increase the intensity of the gameplay. Most importantly, he added a bloop sound every time the ball returned, which was lacking in the silent Magnavox version. Now, this is the epitome of minimalist sophistication when it comes to what can be done on a black and white monitor with minimal graphics. Now, if you remember, Computer Space, one of these early arcade games, was very confusing and had incredibly complex rules. Pong had only one sentence of instructions below the screen. It stated quite simply, avoid missing ball for high score. The creators, of course, ascertained that even the most inebriated players could understand how to play it thus. Now, it is a two-player game that was placed in social settings such as bars. So you could play against an AI opponent if you wished, but you can see there are knobs on either side of the machine. Now, it's best when played with and against another human. It became so popular, therefore, that the games kept breaking down, and so angry bar owners would call Atari complaining. When they came to investigate, they found out that people had put so many quarters in the slots it simply could not take anymore. With its success, Atari received $50,000 of a credit line from Wells Fargo to expand its operations. Atari then sold Pong for $1,200 and cost $300 to $400 to make per unit. Therefore, this was an early success. It was, in fact, one of the most profitable coin-operated machines in history, averaging around $50 a week with the average machine. Therefore, Pong managed to make 4 times that at $200 a week. Once business owners learned of its success, they, of course, wanted one for their establishment. Now, at the end of 1973, Atari had already sold 2,500 Pong machines. It was so successful that, in fact, it is often mistaken and cited as the first video game in history, due to the fact that it's the first one to achieve mainstream prominence. This is, of course, not the case, since we had an entire class last time going over others. But most people, when asked what the first video game is in the general public, they remember Pong. Now, the business model used by Atari is widespread today, which is to copy another game, just as Pong had copied Magnavox's tennis. And, as such, every manufacturer scrambled now to produce a Pong clone of their own. Following the release of Pong, Atari tried to stay ahead of everyone copying their model of Pong, and produced original titles such as Gotcha, Space Race, and Quack, which should sound relatively familiar moving forward. That is to say, Gotcha is a maze chasing game about kissing. Now, this is one of the most bizarre games because the controllers, you can see on the left-hand image here, look like pink rubber breasts. The other games, such as Space Race, is where you would dodge asteroid fields, and one that would become Duck Hunt eventually, that people are familiar with in the Nintendo Entertainment System, Quack, used a light gun and was about hunting ducks, as you can see at the right. While none of the titles just mentioned became incredibly popular, Atari did continue its business model by taking an idea of someone else and improving upon it again, especially in the example of Nutting Associates' Missile Radar of 1973. In this game, by a competing company, players would shoot down incoming missiles before they were allowed to hit the ground. Now, a former employee of Atari had created this, and so it was apropos that Atari then decides to adopt and make their own version. Now, it's very telling that at this time we have the Cold War happening and mutually assured destruction or MAD on every mind in the Western world. That is to state that at any moment, either the Russians or the Americans could launch nuclear weapons and destroy the other country, but in turn, launching their missiles would destroy us. The intercontinental ballistic missiles were seen on nightly news and were touted by both the Americans and by the Russians. Therefore, the popularity of such games relates to this Cold World paranoia, that being at any time the world could end. Therefore, it's very topical, we must remember. Would be David Thoyer, who in his Missile Command would update and improve upon the previous model in 1980. He improved upon it in several ways. Now we have 3 turrets at the bottom of the screen seen here protecting cities, these little sections in blue below these raised sections, from these incoming missiles that you see above with these red streaks. Now, you use a trackball control on-screen cursor, which gives much more effective aiming for the player. Now, any of the 3 turrets could be fired at a particular spot, and thus, of course, it's a very challenging game, but yet rewarding. And once you hit a spot, there's an expanding explosion, such as the white balls you see here on the left, that would destroy any missiles in the radius. It starts off relatively slow with a few missiles, making it relatively easy to stop them. But then multiple missiles begin crisscrossing the screen in ever-increasing number. So you must, if you want to win, hit several of them at the same time. Thus, this is going to be one of the key psychological components that very successful games are going to play off of. That being trying to panic the player by having multiple things happening at the same time. And in order to win, you must have a type of steely resolve and detachment. So this type of control is what is satisfying. Now, you must, of course, keep from destroying all of these cities, for when all the cities are destroyed by these missiles, or your turrets are destroyed, you lose. Switching gears, Cyan Engineering created the first ever driving video game for Atari in 1974 called Grand Track 10. It was a top-down perspective racetrack that was squashed onto a single screen. The surrounding cabinet also had a steering wheel, foot pedals seen here at the right, and a gear stick, everything simulating the driving experience. The car, as you can see here, is nothing more than a dot on the screen, but it was an enormous success nonetheless. It nearly, in fact, bankrupted Atari because of how successful it was. Given all of the additional equipment and bells and whistles associated with it, such as the steering wheel, pedals, and etc., with the cabinet, they grossly underestimated the total cost and underpriced it, therefore lost quite a bit of money with this particular item. Now, they lost another $500,000 as well when they tried to start up and enter the Japanese market with Atari Japan. The Japanese market and the American markets, making up the largest share of video game markets in the world, was dominated by their own companies that we'll discuss here shortly. Now, Steve Bristow was going to be the one who saves Atari, being one of their engineers. He desired to revise Computer Space, which came out originally in 1961. Now, Computer Space, if you remember, was incredibly complex and difficult to control. So what he wanted to do was take the idea of computer space with the spacecraft and make it serve an average player by slowing it way down. Thus, he chose tanks as an option. So Tank is going to come out designed by Bristow in 1974. Now, he was working for Key Games at the time, which is very interesting. So we find that they were actually owned by Atari, set up as a false competitor to make it look like Atari was more popular and powerful than they actually were. So in fact, here you can see what this particular tank game looked like as you maneuvered through these areas, eventually becoming the first game that would be offered with the at-home console sold by Atari, Combat, which we'll return to in a moment. Now, it's slower paced than Computer Space, where you have these walls that block off certain angles, therefore you can't fire through them. In addition, he added scattered mines to increase and improve gameplay and unpredictability. Now, one of the first games ever to use an integrated circuit-based memory, specifically a mask ROM or read-only memory, to store the graphical data seen here rather than a diode array. Therefore, this is one of the steps forward that we see technologically in game development and design. The rapid success with this game allowed Bushnell and Atari to merge these two companies. So whereas the former company was set up as a Skunks Works, and a project that came out of this Skunks Works turned into an enormous home success and rescued Atari from its failings with the first driving video game and Atari Japan. Building on this technological innovation, Al Alcorn, who had designed Pong for Atari in 1972, decides to make a home version in 1974. Now, unlike Magnavox's Odyssey, it used integrated circuits, thus drastically reducing the cost of each unit sold. Now, electronic circuits here and integrated circuits are merely on a small semiconducting material, and they perform the same function as a larger circuit made up from discrete components. Hence, you can do more with less. Here we have the Sears Telegames Pong by Atari of 1975. It was made possible by Don Valentine, a venture capitalist who invested $20 million in the company in order to bring this home. So the Sears Telegame is actually called as such because there was an exclusive distribution deal set up by Sears, the now defunct company, in which we find 150,000 units are going to be sold over Christmas alone in 1975. The simple name recognition of Pong was so far expanded in the American consciousness that it opened up the new potential for home gaming and a new wave of home consoles to come. Now, the problem with Pong, as one might imagine, is that the design is incredibly easy to copy. Therefore, in 2 years, more than 60 home Pong consoles would be on the market, and 10 million would be sold in the United States alone. Here we have some examples you can see off to the left. But Atari knew the future was not in the integrated circuit that they had used for their Sears Telepong, because integrated circuits could perform only a single function. But a microprocessor, on the other hand, which was called a computer on a chip at the time, had the ability to incorporate these functions of central processing units on a single integrated circuit. Therefore, it could do even more. Now, to sell the machine, then individual game cartridges could be made, and here is the business model for all home console games to this day, is you design the machine to play it and then sell the actual game separately. So plug and play finally became possible with the microprocessor. The problem for Atari was that someone else got there first. Jerry Lawson is going to design the video entertainment system launched in 1976. Working for the Fairchild Company, the microprocessing company with the leading CPU, or central processing unit, in the world at the time, they had the best-selling computer chip in the world and wanted to capitalize on the possibilities of a CPU with video games' recent popularity. They're going to hire Jerry to design this, to become the first ROM cartridge-based game console, and the first one to use a microprocessor. Therefore, it actually predates the Atari. Now, with the VES, or Video Entertainment System, of 1976, you could insert cartridges without destroying the semiconductors. Now, it had 64 bytes of RAM, an audio chip, thus, of course, it actually had audio, unlike the Magnavox Odyssey. It had an internal speaker and a hardwired radio frequency, or RF cord. Now, the output was made possible 8 different colors, which was unthinkable at the time, with 128 by 64 pixels of resolution. Now, what is unusual about the VES is the unusual controllers, which were held vertically with a hand grip, with a triangular button at the top that could be pushed down to fire or maneuvered as a joystick. It was the first ever example that we have in video games, this unit, as we would say, of a hold button to pause the game. And you could also use this feature to speed up or slow down the speed of each game. Now, with it, 250,000 units were sold, so in that way it was a success. However, it failed for 2 reasons. One, because it did not take advantage of the interchangeable cartridges, and the games, frankly, were lackluster. And secondly, because it woke the sleeping giant. It scared Atari into action because they didn't want to miss out on this revolution that they had started. The Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, of 1977 was named as such for comparison with the VES. So Atari already had a prototype named Stella for years sitting in their warehouse. So the success of the VES led Bushnell, the head of the company, to sell it to Warner Communications in 1976 for $28 million. If, in fact, Warner would make Stella, this new home console system, their priority, and producing it as fast as humanly possible. So they chose the VCS again in order to immediately have a comparison with the VES, which is their main competitor. It sold initially for $199, quite expensive for the day, but they did not make the same mistake as Magnavox. It included 2 joysticks, 2 paddle controllers, 1 cartridge, which is Combat, where you see tanks that are going to be driving around this area, much like the game we just talked about a moment ago, which was a top-down shooter, a multiplayer only, which means you cannot play with an AI, you must have 2 people playing it, would go through 27 different arenas with 3 different vehicles that blasted one another in this maze. The VCS would go on to sell more consoles than any other in history, with 250,000 by the end of 1977 alone. Because of this success, the VES withdrew from the market immediately, leaving Atari solely dominating the home video game console business. It wasn't discontinued until 1992, with 30 million sold total. Now, the system was a great success because of two reasons. One, they had great developers, and two, because they had the licenses for some of the most popular arcade games that they could then turn into home versions. While the success of their home console was taking off, Atari was careful to continue to cultivate their market in arcades. It would be Bushnell and Steve Bristow who developed Breakout in 1976, which was, unlike their original idea, which was to take an existing game like tennis for Magnavox and turn it into Pong. Here we have something original, which was intended as a sequel to Pong, but was far more interesting. In it, the bat would move horizontally across the bottom of the screen, a precursor to later shooting games like Galaga, Space Invaders, and others. The ball would bounce upward toward a wall of bricks, destroying each brick as it bounced off it. Now, the goal of Breakout is to destroy all of the bricks, but the trick here is that it becomes more difficult as there are fewer and fewer bricks to hit, so you must aim very carefully. Not to mention the ball actually speeds up as the game progresses. Now, you can bank it off of the walls and get the ball trapped in a pocket, thus, of course, destroying multiple bricks in between these sections. But if you are going to hit the top of the screen, your paddle is cut in half each time, thus giving you less to work with and less time to do it in. All in all, a very successful game. It is timeless, specifically because it is historically important. It's going to have the exact design mimicked by countless developers thereafter with these specific rules of speeding up as time goes on and punishing the player for these mistakes. Another very successful and innovative game by Atari was actually designed by programmer Carol Shaw, and River Raid would be a top-down shooter in 1982 that gradually would narrow the player's options as you'll fly ever smaller and smaller corridors where a wall collision would destroy your vehicle. It is one of the first, interestingly enough, to randomly generate the placement of enemies or items in a level. Therefore, the game is always new because you cannot memorize the routes. You do not know where the dangers are coming from or where they will appear. Alongside the titles for the VCS or the home console, Atari continued arcade development to stay ahead of their competitors. Here we have Star Raiders of 1979, designed by Doug Neubauer. It is an unknown classic, so most people will be unfamiliar with it in this class, but it is the greatest programming accomplishment of its time. In it, you're going to serve as a space pirate in the very first free-roaming first-person perspective game. The rest that we have been looking at have been top-down or side views of static or scrolling scenes. Now we can roam wherever. Therefore, it mixes strategy in this with shooting. So you engage in dogfights in this seemingly vast and endless space. Building upon this idea, we also have David Braden and Ian Bell designing Elite for the BBC Micro Company in 1984. Being inspired by Star Raiders, because it does have dogfighting, we have one of the most important titles ever released. Unlike its predecessor, Star Raiders, Elite was very well known and popular, therefore was more influential in this way. It is set within a cold-hearted universe where the only rules are going to be to get rich and don't get caught while you're doing it. Reflecting what's happening in the 1980s in Britain with this amoral capitalism at the core, you can trade for anything in this elite world. You can trade food, weapons, and even slaves, for instance. There is a vast scale of this game with 8 galaxies. Therefore, it feels like there is always something new to find. And in fact, there is. In the 1980s, Atari was the undisputable king of the video game industry, in the arcade and at home. But due to bad business practices, it is going to slowly lose its grasp, lose its demand and its dominance. One of the major reasons why Atari is going to start to fail is because they refuse to give credit to their designers. They did not put the names we've been discussing on the cartridges or on the games themselves. Disgruntled employees began leaving, therefore their best programmers and developers went out to make their own companies. For example, founding Activision, which is now the world's largest third-party publisher as of today for video games. Thus, Atari lost much of its talent to such hemorrhaging to these new companies like Activision. And because talent was gone, quality control began lacking and began slipping. While Atari was riding the wave of video game success, the challengers that will rise in order to take shares of the market began rather modestly with PC gaming. One of the most ubiquitous and well-known, Oregon Trail, found its origins in 1971 with the original board game version. Designed by Don Rawich, Bill Heineman, and Paul Dillenberg, we have a history teacher that was very invested in his students moving beyond merely the dates to understand that these were people that lived experiences in founding the United States. Specifically, he would dress in period attire to give lectures and came up with this idea to make the journey of the Oregon Trail a 2,000-mile journey where pioneers are going to cross the United States from east to west in the 19th century, from Independence, Missouri, into Oregon City, looking for a better life. He wanted them to know what it was actually like. So first, he believes it would make a good board game. The route from the 1800s frontier map he would give to his class, and then he made cards that would say things like dysentery or broken arm. You would roll a die to advance and encounter random misfortunes. Here we have an updated version of the early crude game that he's going to develop. But the basic premise is going to be realized as a game by his friends. Don Rawich and Bill Heineman, for instance, are going to be math programmers. And so we find their background is in maths and or mathematics and in computer programming, respectively. Now, they, over a period of 2 weeks, programmed the script as a game, as you see here to the left, and it was played on a teletype machine. Now, as you can see, this teletype machine has no monitor. Therefore, it is played by printing out games descriptions where it tells you what's happening. It then asks the player for instructions by return, that being what you're going to do, much like rolling a die. So you find that in the classroom, they would hand out a map of the frontier as discussed, and then bring in this machine that would be fed instructions. It became so popular among students that it was used by all of them in Minneapolis, in every school district. But by the end of the term, the designers and developers thought that it had run its course, so they printed out all the source code and deleted it from the machine. If we fast forward, Rawich is going to get a job with the Minnesota Education Computing Consortium, or the MECC. Now, at his new job, they're desperate for new games, especially educational games, for what they are going to be doing. So he painstakingly typed out the original code he had printed out. And since the MECC became a consortium, they licensed it in nearly every school in America because it was designed for the Apple II, which was purchased for all these school districts. Therefore, every child growing up in the era, including myself, remember playing this as part of class. The basic visuals are added. Originally, there's only descriptions as to what happened, such as breaking a wagon wheel, getting dysentery, or a member of your party dying. But these basic visuals helped illustrate the journey's progress, as you see here in this original version, which gives you the date, the weather, the health of your party, how much food you have, what is your next landmark. And so the game is undeniably a pioneer in edutainment, that being educational games that are entertaining. And there's a huge market for that now. It is also the first strategy game, the first strategy video game, we should say, that requires careful planning, resource management, and calculating the risk of what you should be doing. Therefore, good players are going to hoard rations and learn how to make it through, understanding that that counts. And the ability to name your 5 settlers also added an element of pathos. Therefore, especially when one of them you name dies, because there are random chance afflictions that are going to befell your given party. So each playthrough, because they are random, just like the roll of a die, are different. So you find that there's a different game each time. But there's still a consistent arc of lessons learned. So you should, of course, be very frugal with what you have available. You should ensure you have lots of food. You shouldn't take risks. You shouldn't ford rivers, etc. And so it helps you understand what the experience was like. As far as its educational benefit, that is questionable as far as understanding the different dates, time periods, and historical era. But understanding the experience, it certainly is a success. The game was so popular and had so many iterations that it is going to have spawned even parodies. So the Men Who Wear Many Hats are going to design the Oregon Trail, released in 2010, which remakes it on the premise of a zombie apocalypse, which is going to be a staple of the 2000s. Now, demonstrating here that the simple mechanics that were at play in the Oregon Trail still work for modern audiences, where you have a group of people, you are going to be set within this particular world, given certain afflictions that are thrust upon you that you cannot predict and need to react to it. Therefore, it's a lasting formula. Now, Oregon Trail certainly is the most famous of the early computer games that were developed. Another, which is not so famous but equally influential, came from William Crowther. Now, he was a programmer consulting for the firm Bolt at that time, including Beranek and Newman, or BBN. They were the team that developed the ARPANET, which is the first steps towards the internet as we know it today, funded by the U.S. Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. This is going to have the simple task of linking together 4 university computers into a network or backbone across the country so they could share research data. So Crowther is going to, as part of his leisure, enjoy being an outdoorsman, especially rock climbing and then finally caving. So he enjoyed finding new routes in caves, and his favorite was in the longest in the world, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. So he began constructing a cave map on a computer early on. Sadly, he and his wife divorced, and it was the impetus of this, the divorce, which caused him to create a game because he missed his children so much that they could play together. Now, the game is heavily inspired by another game from the 1970s, Dungeons & Dragons, first released in 1974. So Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, was a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, or RPG. In role-playing games, you find that different characters would take on the persona of these other characters or avatars in a given world or construct. So this is recognized as the beginning of modern role-playing games with D&D and the role-playing game industry in general. Characters would be created by the players, given certain powers and abilities and equipment, and then embark on imaginary adventures in a fantasy setting. So therefore, you could, of course, adopt one of a wizard, a warrior, a thief, etc. They all had specific characteristics that would benefit one another that you would play in a group. So Crowther is going to design this world much like that of D&D, but set it within a cave. So the original name of Adventure, released in 1975, we must remember, was Colossal Cave Adventure. It was inspired by the freedom that we see with D&D to construct your own world. It is, in fact, the computer version of D&D, if you want to understand it as such, based on Mammoth Cave with a high fantasy and travel writing twist. Now, it's based in realism, which is what makes it successful in its own group and its own area, because it used things like caver slang, like Y2, which is a map notation for a survey point. Rooms, in fact, are named after real formations in the cave. You can see the game itself here in the lower right-hand corner, and you can see it in the left-hand corner what the cave actually looks like, if you want to know. Now, it is an entirely text-based game that describes your locations very carefully. It has wonderful prose. And the actions are left up to the player with commands, such as following a stream, which is where the game always begins. Do you go left or right? Do you go north or south? Do you investigate something? So it will describe these new surroundings, and then you can either interact with it or move on. So the game itself is very, very interesting, because until now, games have been all about action and reaction, hitting a ball, shooting something, driving, firing a tank. But adventure required logic and an internal sense of geography and resource management, which makes it like Oregon Trail, only, of course, much broader in scope and much more complex and difficult to play. Now, the problem with adventure is that it was hidden on university networks, the only ones strong enough and powerful enough to run such a computer at the time. Now, until Don Woods found it at Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab on the network, which, if you remember, is connected by way of this network of 4 main universities. He found it, and with the permission of Crowther, made improvements. Taking this source code, Don Woods spread the game all over the country and improved it by adding a save progress function, so you can stop because the game can take hours and hours and hours to play. He also added the ability to take stock of inventory, check one's score, and even added new mazes and the famous troll, beanstalk, and other alternative areas to explore in the game. Therefore, we can state that adventure is the inspiration for the entire genre here of RPG games that are video games. Now, Tim Anderson, Mark Blank, and Dave Lebling, along with Bruce Daniels, were working on Zork in 1979. They all formed Infocom and made some of the greatest text games ever, being highly influenced by Adventure, this RPG. Now, Adventure would have remained in a small community, except Warren Robinett is going to develop it for a broader market for Atari and home consoles. And he would call it Adventure as the original title, released in 1979. So he translated this vast text-based world to a top-down, two-dimensional world very common in Atari games, much like Combat that we saw. So the original interface with Adventure, as we discussed, was very frustrating, and it was appreciated by computer specialists simply because it was obtuse. You had to know exactly what the computer wanted using very specific terminology, so they would enjoy trying different word combinations, much like tumblers in a lock or a crossword puzzle, to make it work. In order to make the game mainstream, we have Robinett here designing this new, first-of-its-kind exploration game that's visual, whereby you find that there are 30 rooms total with many different items that you can interact with and a continue option, much as what was developed for the original adventure game we just discussed, because it takes so long to play. Now, he also added 3 dragons to the game that randomly chase the player. If they catch the player, they will have to restart at the starting point, and you would lose everything that was collected if caught. The player really is just a yellow square that seeks to find a sword and keys to unlock each castle for these 30 different rooms. The goal, of course, is to find the enchanted chalice, which had been stolen by a magician to save a kingdom. Now, you must kill the dragons by finding these swords and then poking them, as you see here in the upper left. Now, it is the first video game that does many things. One, it's the first one to have a sprite, which in fact is a bat that flies around picking up and dropping off objects. It also is the first to have an Easter egg. So because Atari refused to give designers credit, Robinett added a secret room that is very difficult to get to, and Atari itself didn't know about it for years. And in this secret room, it actually states, seen here at the lower left, created by Warren Robinett. It was, of course, fashioned and showcased in the 2018 film by Steven Spielberg, Ready Player One, showing it was the first Easter egg. The term was coined by Atari itself, not discovered till years later, but they did not delete it once they discovered it because it was so clever. So now we have Easter eggs commonly placed in most games that players who are in the habit of seeking and searching and exploring want to find as a reward. So the first games to make exploration a focus of their experience are what we just discussed here with Adventure. They crafted a linear structure allowing for branching experimentation where you can go where you want. Later on, this will turn into the go anywhere, do anything games like Grand Theft Auto. But it is the first virtual world that actually feels like one. Now, the biggest markets at this time, as we discussed, were in the US and in Japan. That doesn't mean that nothing was happening in Europe. Just like today, we find that Eastern Europe and Russia especially is primarily focused on the black market for video game production, development, and sales. In Europe proper, the UK is the biggest market. The development of gaming and PCs in the UK begins with Clive Sinclair, affectionately nicknamed Uncle Clive. He would develop his ZX, later the ZX Spectrum being the most popular in 1982. And this would be the home computer for the masses in the UK, which made computers accessible for young children and adults. It was the fastest selling in Britain, being affordable at £79 and undercutting the Apple II. With the latest model, we find that it has 128 kilobytes of memory and thus is going to produce some of the greatest video games on this unit. As part of the ZX Spectrum in 1982, we know that the computer was easy to program with games because the games were sold as audio tapes and could be copied over. This is the era of the bedroom coder and where the beginnings of the indie game development community came from. Now, they developed for the ZX Spectrum over 2,400 titles, though it is only successful in the UK. It does illustrate the game buying appetite that existed in Europe as well as the United States, and it supported a large development community. For instance, games such as Nigel Alderton's Chucky Egg of 1983, whereby you would steal eggs from angry hens. It had a very fluid movement and graceful jumping arcs that would be later imitated by games such as Donkey Kong. Now, it would randomize enemy patterns here, so you couldn't predict where they'd be coming from. And interestingly enough, after beating the game, whereby you see a duck in a cage in the upper left-hand corner, the duck would be set loose and would start chasing you, thus adding another level of complexity to this game and made it enjoyable another time. Along with games such as that, Matthew Smith in his Manic Miner of 1983 shows this experimental and bizarre streak in the UK for designing games with bizarre premises. You actually play Willie, a trapped miner, in a mine with limited air supply. There are 20 themed rooms with deadly toilet seats, psychopathic penguins, poisonous pansies, and the goal is to get the key in each room to escape each screen to move on. Now, British games at this time seemingly would be influenced by Salvador Dali and other surrealists, but were as indebted to the comedy group Monty Python for the bizarre scenarios and the kind of ridiculousness of many of these characters and adversaries. Building on this unique aspect of UK design, we have Mel Coucher, Andrew Stagg as these designers and developers who are going to be putting out Deus Ex Machina in 1984, which was the most original multimedia project. Whereby you have a game, but it was also bundled with atmosphere or an ambient soundtrack. Now, Translating roughly God into the machine, Deus Ex Machina is going to refer to Greek tragedies and plays, where gods must appear on stage to resolve human conflicts. The soundtrack also had dialogue over it, with musician Ian Dury, comedian Frankie Howard, and actor John Pudi, which would play alongside the game, much like people would play The Dark Side of the Moon and watch The Wizard of Oz, giving it an eerie ambiance. And the premise of the game led credence to that ambiance and eeriness. So Deus Ex Machina is actually going to be designed around the premise that you would raise this mutant, this unwanted side effect of genetic trials, from a fetal stage to old age via this machine as seen here on the left. The environment is nightmarish in this dystopian design, which was heavily influenced by George Orwell's 1984, with this understanding that we have this dystopian society that is going to be crushing the human spirit. So it did successfully create an original headspace. Unfortunately, despite great critical reception, it was a commercial failure. Because of the incredibly high cost, most retailers wouldn't even stock it. While Deus Ex Machina was very dark and brooding and mysterious, the opposite side of the UK trend can be represented here by School Days, designed by David Wrighty and Keith Warrington. Released in 1984, the whole point of School Days is playing as a schoolboy Eric, where you see the whole school and other characters, including the headmaster, students, and so on. The goal is to get your report card from the headmaster's safe, and there are countless ways to do it, but that's not where the joy lies in this particular game. Instead, it is entertaining because you shouldn't be beating the game. It's more fun to cause mischief, blaming people for things that you did, setting up traps, etc. And so this type of game, which is fun for fun's sake, is another avenue which future developers will take. Now, Clive Sinclair and ZX Spectrum, that was released in 1982, was the original computer for the masses. But it would be Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore International, who was a ruthless businessman who would come up with the next in the generation for PC gaming. He started out selling typewriters and then calculators until Texas Technologies put him out of business there. So in 1976, he purchased a chip manufacturer that was used by Apple II and Atari. As part of that, he hired Bob Russell, Bob Yanez, and David Zimbicki to create Commodore 64 in 1982. After the company found success with its earlier versions in computers, the PET and the VIC-20, and we find that this is the first computer to sell 1 million units. The Commodore 64 was designed to be powerful and cheap at $595, whereas the Apple 800, for instance, cost $899, and the Apple II cost $1,200. Therefore, it was nearly half the price of its competitors. This was backed up with the advertising slogan, "You won't get a better computer for double the price." Now, it was named as such, that being Commodore 64, because of the kilobytes that it had. They sold 30 million units by 1994 when it was discontinued. Now, what made the Commodore 64 superior was its open architecture. It provided detailed documentation as to how to program it and to work with the internal construction, as well as being quite cheap. Atari, on the other hand, was very, very guarded about its proprietary programming and never released it. So therefore, we have high-quality developers beginning to make software for the Commodore 64. One of the first and best examples is by Danielle Bunton and her 1983 Mule, which was a 4-player trading game which could either be opponents or played by humans or AI. The goal is to colonize a planet through effective resource management. The core mechanic of Mule are going to be these mules seen here that you can purchase and upgrade before assigning them to mine for resources. It was a sophisticated economic system based on supply and demand that makes it successful and integrated in the game, to where you compete against one another in real-time auction systems. Another game, which would be the grandfather for all later versions of its genre, was developed by David Crane, called Little Computer People in 1985 for the Commodore 64. Whereas Deus Ex Machina was a very dark vision of a dystopian future, we find that Little Computer People was upbeat and came with a manual emphasizing how these little people were real and that you were their caretaker. It opens with a side view of a house where a little man will walk around going about his day and his business, cooking, sleeping, watching TV, and so on. Now, you can interact with the little man by offering him gifts or having simple commands or playing poker with him. But there was nothing like it at the time because this little avatar, this version, had a personality that was randomly generated. Therefore, no two of them were alike depending upon which version that you bought. Now, the memory would be retained from the interactions with the player, so it could continue on where you left off. So we find that the personality was also generated because sometimes this character would sulk or it would rap on the screen to try to get your attention if you weren't paying attention to it. And so it was very, very original. So it's inspiring for many later very important versions of this genre, such as LucasArts' Habitat, seen on the left, or the very influential Wright Sim series that we will return to. Now, there are a few other notable mentions when it comes to the developments of the Commodore 64, such as Project Firestarter. Now, this is an early survival horror genre game whereby the atmosphere is going to communicate an environmental narrative. The problem is, even though the advertisement seen at the left shows a Giger-esque alien-like creature ripping through a hull of a ship, that the enemies are actually invisible. Another notable mention would be Lode Runner, which was a classical game that people still remember and love today because it's a puzzle platformer that allows players to construct their own levels. And so the DIY version of gaming that we'll talk about in the demo scene will continue on. Now, the enormous longevity of the Commodore 64 speaks to its success. It lasts until the 1990s, but it still survives in the demoscene subculture, which is where we have international computer art subculture practitioners who focus on producing demos, these self-contained, usually small computer programs. Now, the company went bankrupt in 1994 because it continually slashed prices to undercut the competition, such as Atari and Apple, but its influence is still felt today. Now, the console crash of 1982, where we have all of these options, and helps explain what happened. So if you were looking to buy a home video game console, you could choose from the Atari VCS we talked about, or the Atari 5200, the ColecoVision that many people were beloved childhood memories, the Emerson Arcadia 2001, the Fairchild Channel F2, Intellivision, Intellivision 2, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Tandyvision. We have all of these options. There was a problem, though. They all suffered from poor quality, and they jumped on the bandwagon after the Atari Gold Rush, in which everyone now sought to get into the video game market and develop games. But it led to poor quality because we have a rush of amateur developers who didn't know what they were doing, putting out poor products. It was exacerbated by the fact that we have new competition with home computers, as mentioned Apple II, Commodore's PET, the Atari 400 and 800, and, importantly, IBM's PC 5150, which popularized the term personal computer. In fact, it launched the first time it sold with Adventure, the game that we discussed. So it made PCs, that being PCs made thus these video game consoles look like fossils at this point. PC games were easy to duplicate, they were cheap, they were less expensive, and they were more flexible. So if we think of the crash and the end of the industry, it's highlighted by two games in particular that are cautionary tales. There were two disastrous releases that came about back to back. One was Todd Fry's Pac-Man, released on Atari 2600 in 1982. Now, in this example, it was rushed for a Christmas release, for that is the largest season of buying for video games. So Fry, with a very limited time frame, had to strip everything away that made Pac-Man successful, including the waka waka sounds, the movement, the motion, and the strategy. So you can see the difference between the two highlighted here, from the actual arcade version on the left to the at-home version on the right. We find that even the dots are the same color of tiny yellow rectangles as the maze itself, and the ghosts are just going to be these yellow squares. They manufactured 12 million of these, still confident that the name Pac-Man and the name recognition would ensure its success. They were right, millions did sell, but slowly we find consumers brought all of them back demanding refunds. Thus, in turn, retailers who were selling them demanded refunds from Atari. The second and arguably greatest disaster in the history of video games, giving it the title the worst video game ever, was designed by Howard Scott Warshaw for the most high-profile video game ever released, E.T. Now, this high-profile game, released in 1982, seemingly would have been a slam dunk for the industry. E.T. was an international success, the Spielberg film. Everyone saw it. It was internationally known. So Atari buys the rights to Spielberg's blockbuster in July of 1982. But they needed to be ready by September, a mere few months later, for Christmas manufacturing. This led Warshaw to move incredibly rapidly and cut corners on the design, to where the game is then played with the goal of you being E.T., seen here in these screenshots, trying to find phone parts in order to call home. It is a top-down, two-dimensional landscape populated by adults attempting to kidnap E.T., as seen here on the left with the man in the yellow trench coat. They also would steal the phone parts from E.T., but there's an additional complication. These green areas that you see were pits that you can fall into, and there was a very strict time limit as to when you had to accomplish certain tasks. Now, it was infuriating to play because the movements were incredibly sluggish, and because of the pixel perfect collision detection, meaning when pixels are going to overlap with another one, causing something to happen, that you would fall into a pit when you were nowhere near the pit. Now, the second, of course, failure of the game is obviously that the visuals paled in comparison with the blockbuster spectacular special effects that people had just seen. So you put those two things together and you have a recipe for disaster. It was so bad that 5 million cartridges were produced, and enraged customers and retailers demanded refunds. Now, along with Pac-Man, the second failed venture that we just discussed, this is going to destroy the hard-won reputation that Atari had built as a quality software developer. Not only did they damage the reputation with customers and consumers, but also the relationships with retailers who no longer wanted to stock their product. This led inevitably to what was an urban legend in 1983 with the video game crash, where 10 to 20 dump trucks buried millions of dollars worth of unsold Atari inventory in New Mexico landfill, and then for some inexplicable reason covered it with concrete. This was dug up quite recently, and the documentary showing the downfall of Atari is in this module below if you wish to watch it. Now, the retailers saw this collapse as merely inevitable, that video games were a fad, that U.S. consumers' appetite for video games has ended. They no longer wish to buy them. What they failed to realize was actually that the audience playing video games was actually becoming more discerning. They wanted a better product and experience. And that actually led to the downfall of Atari, overlooking that and not putting out quality products. At the same time, we see the peak and decline of home video game consoles, highlighted with Atari's failure. We have at the same time the golden age of arcades that will begin in the 70s and peak in the 1980s. Now, leading up to the first release of video games like Pong in arcades, we have several examples from Sega, such as the Periscope, Missile, and Grand Prix, all from the 1960s, which are going to be amusement arcades, which were not video games because, of course, they did not have this type of interactivity. Instead, they had a mixture of lights, a projected film, which were intended as one-off entertainments, but didn't function the same way as what we were discussing. Now, with the success of Pong, we find the industry will shift towards fully electronic cabinets because they were dedicated to one game. They're easier to mass produce because they have fewer moving parts. Thus, there is less maintenance associated with them as opposed to the games I just mentioned. Now, they began to pop up in bars, bowling alleys, and restaurants as we find these owners realize their potential. So in the 1970s and 80s, arcades are going to have the advantage over home consoles because they have far better effects. Now, the pay-to-play nature of arcade games are going to dictate the design that we're going to discuss here shortly, to where you're not supposed to play the game continuously for long periods, but much as we talked about with the earliest video games, that they were set in around 90-second intervals to get people off the machine as quickly as possible to get other people playing. So thus we enter the golden age of arcades. The golden age of arcades begins, arguably, with the first arcade phenomenon designed by Nishikado, and that's going to be his Space Invaders, released in 1978. The whole arcades we find across the world actually opened just because of this game. That's how widespread it was, based on and inspired by H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds theme of these aliens coming down and attacking Earth. It had custom hardware with plastic overlays to color black and white visuals. So you can see that there are green formations at the bottom of the screen. That is not from the television or cathode ray tube, but instead is merely an overlay. But the game, nonetheless, was so popular it sold 300,000 units by 1980. It is regarded as the first modern video game because it provides feedback to the player and acts upon the player simultaneously. Thus, you control a small ship, which is designed to be Earth's last defense against these alien invaders coming down, moving horizontally. So the ship you control is at the bottom, moving beneath these 4 barriers that protect you in your firing position to stop incoming shots. So you would move shooting upward at these aliens, who would, in 5 even horizontal rows, move left to right and then back over again, dropping each time. The rhythmic bleeps are going to match the speed of the enemies. Thus, every time they drop down, they go faster. The music goes faster as a crescendo, and as they move ever closer, thus to increase the drama felt by the player. Now, you could only shoot 3 shots at a time and had to wait until they cleared the screen or hit an alien above. Therefore, the player learned early on that firing wildly is the worst strategy you can take. You must carefully choose your shots and time them because you only have so many. Another very important game at this time, designed by Ed Rothberg, released in 1980, was Battlezone. Atari at this point was on a hot streak, and in this example it showed the success of vector graphics. So instead of having large blocky pixels like a similar game Below Combat that we discussed, released with the original VCS by Atari, we have clean, crisp lines that are going to draw clear geometric architecture in a wireframed 3D landscape where other marauding enemy tanks are going to be hunted down by you. We could compare it here to the 2D game on the right, Combat, to where it feels more like a world that can be explored as you move around three-dimensionally in 360 degrees instead of the static top-down look of other home console games. And also because of the rich background details like a volcano and mountains, we're going to have the effect intensified. The smooth motion that this is going to cause was the result of an amalgamation of styles where we strategically maneuver the tank to the right position, as you see in the lower left-hand corner, lining up on the enemy's flush side before firing. So it was so successful, in fact, in its simulation that it is the first crossover video game and military training technology. For the US military saw this and asked Atari to produce a more realistic version for their use in training tank commanders. Rotberg was very opposed to this idea and only begrudgingly agreed later on, with the promise that he would never be asked to do work for the military again. This is just the first in a long line of crossovers from military technology, which of course is now ironic because video games were originally developed and inspired by military technology like the ENIAC. Now in turn they're going to be used by the military for their purposes, not for entertainment, but for training the military personnel and not endangering soldiers' lives. Many of these early games that we've been discussing were shooters, first person or otherwise, but the most inspired and original game to come out in 1980 was designed by Ed Logg and Donna Bailey, Centipede, which is very, very famous for it used a trackball for its controls, which allowed for much finer precision of the shots. Now, the entire game is designed around planning your shots very carefully, and it's set within a surreal garden landscape, which looks like it's populated with tiny trees or mushrooms. We have a giant centipede that always starts at the top of the screen and moves horizontally before descending in rows closer and closer to the player. Each shot that the player takes turns a section of the centipede into a brick and usually divides the creature into two halves. Thus now you have two centipedes. Therefore, careless firing costs lives because you need to line up where these bricks occur in order to have several sections of the centipede destroyed at the same time. We find here that Namco originally is going to manufacture equipment for fairgrounds, is a Japanese company, and with the rise of the arcade business, many companies like it wish to enter the foray and their own versions of arcades. It would be Sawano in his Galaxian of 1979 that they did so first. Galaxian is going to improve upon Space Invaders and others because it is not as rigid as far as the ranks of aliens. We have a brightly colored display where the aliens would dive bomb the player. At the time, these were groundbreaking, very detailed visuals that allowed for greater flexibility and maneuverability on the part of the player or the pilot of the spacecraft. However, the game that would make Namco's reputation and would cause success for the company, selling the most units and is arguably the most profitable arcade game ever, was designed by Toru Iwatani in 1980. Iwatani wanted to make a game, not a shooter, not a war game, not a military game that appealed primarily to men, but instead a game that would appeal equally to men as well as women. So he settled on the concept of eating because everyone likes to eat. So the game and the goal is to eat dots spread around a maze, and the enemies are these cute ghosts with large googly eyes. Therefore, it can't be understood as sinister or as somehow dystopian. Therefore, it is meant to appeal to all ages and genders. Originally, as seen on the left, it was called Puckman because Iwatani believed he looked like a hockey puck. But the Midway, which is the American distributor for Pac-Man, feared that the game would be vandalized because of the name, and so therefore changed it to Pac-Man. In case you can't tell, Puckman, the P looks remarkably like an F. Iwatani here with Pac-Man is going to key in on a brilliant design which has the most simple twist of video games that are so successful, in which in one moment you are the hunted with these 4 ghosts chasing you down in this maze, but eating one of 4 power pills are going to turn the ghosts blue, and once again they become the hunted. So we have this turn of roles here that is very exciting. Now, couple that with the Waka Waka sound effect, the playing of Pac-Man is very rewarding. The configuration of levels is also going to be successful by Iwatani, in which they confuse the player into locking them into ever smaller and smaller circles as they're trying to collect the pellets to ensure that the ghosts, which have different behavioral AI, will corner you from different directions. Now, in terms of feedback loops, this is one of the most potent video games ever produced that holds up even today, making you want to play again and again and again. It is an instant smash hit, selling 400,000 cabinets worldwide. It is estimated that it made over $2.5 billion in quarters, which makes it the highest grossing arcade game in all of history. Now, the most successful American-made arcade game, of course, ironically began its life as an unauthorized knockoff. We find here that Doug McCrae, John Talco, and Kevin Curran are going to form a company. They're students that form General Computer Corporation, and they made circuit boards with the intention of installing them in pre-existing cabinets or arcades in order to modify or upgrade them. So they started with a game that they called Crazy Otto, which became known now more famously as Ms. Pac-Man. It was only with the realization by Midway, the distributor for these arcade games, that they saw the potential in this, because it allowed arcade owners who already had older versions of games to upgrade them by merely adding the circuit board, so they didn't have to purchase all the hardware again. They then, of course, renamed Crazy Otto Ms. Pac-Man and added a red bow and lipstick on her. Now, with Ms. Pac-Man, it actually improves upon the earlier version because it has 4 different types of mazes and a degree of variety, where we find that there is a new semi-random ghost behavior, whereby the AI is even more unpredictable than it was in the original Pac-Man. Returning to the success of Space Invaders and Galaxian, we now have Onogi in his Galaga here of 1981, released by Namco, which is a sequel to Galaxian, improving upon it. And it is superior because of the simplicity of its mechanics. Previously, you got one shot at a time with a single enemy diving pattern. That was the original Galaxian design. Now, Galaga, which is much more popular, became an instant classic because it let wave after wave of aliens dominate the space. Masses in ranks, they would, of course, form up before looping downward towards the player's ship at different angles, so it was not as predictable and thus more exciting. They would then spiral off screen at the bottom to reappear again at the top to hit you again. Hits in this version would then explode into bright colored pixels with a satisfying boom sound. So the idea is trying to catch the line of diving invaders at the right angle to take care of many of them at the same time. Now, there are quirks in the enemy's patterns that keep the game surprising and unpredictable, thus interesting, because they can move in many different directions instead of the predictable horizontal movement to one side and drop down that we saw with Space Invaders. Now, this is also going to be added an additional flourish, which is a tractor beam seen here in the middle that could try to suck up your spaceship and adds an additional layer of complexity to the game. Turning to something entirely different, we have Konami's Frogger of 1981. Now, this game is very interesting because we'd have no enemies that are out to get the player at all. Instead, the player is a cute yellow-green frog crossing a busy intersection. The goal is to dodge oncoming traffic and then hop over rushing logs seen at the top once we get to this river. There is somewhat of a zen quality of playing Frogger because you wait. You wait and look at patterns until it is safe to cross. But once you cross the street, we have the inversion of the issue, which is you have to time leaps onto logs, hitting something instead of missing things before. As it progresses, obviously like every game, traffic moves faster and then the logs sink unpredictably as you try to jump on them. This was an enormous hit for Konami and was bankrolling many better known later hits. But Frogger is a classic. Considering everything we've discussed, looking at both the advancement of Atari and home consoles and arcade games, it is clear that arcade games have the clear advantage compared to their home console cousins, because the home version, seen here on the right, used relatively abstract visual language. This all changed with a new technology that was very impactful, yet was not long-lasting. And that's going to be the advent of the Laserdisc. So we know here that Don Bluth was a former Disney animator who founded his own company. His first film was, of course, very beautiful, but did not have great critical impact, The Secret of Nim. Perhaps you're familiar with it. He and his studios, Sullivan Bluth Studios, that were founded, were then approached about making a video game called Dragon's Lair, released in 1983. It uses a new storage format called the Laserdisc. Laserdiscs, of course, are going to be the precursor to modern DVDs and other storage devices that could keep high-quality video graphics at this time on the same level as a Disney movie for a video game purpose. What Bluth Studios did was create a branching cartoon whose protagonist was a cowardly knight called Dirk the Daring, and you're supposed to rescue the princess. The animation, once they are going to go through this entire film, was then chopped up, requiring the player to react quickly, as seen on the left here with the controls, to correctly line up with these on-screen prompts. If you didn't, you would die in any number of these gruesome ways. So the problem with this is that it constantly broke down, and you really couldn't make a decent game out of a Laserdisc. But it did look like it was the future. It was something that people had never seen before, but had relatively little interactive capability. All you were really doing in a choose-your-own-adventure style is deciding what chapter on a DVD, for instance, to skip to. The game thus was quite awful, but the visuals were so appealing that it saw worldwide success, despite the unit being incredibly expensive at the time. Now, it was too alluring for players to ignore as well, and even though it cost more to play than any other game in the arcade, something that those that played it at the time remember vividly. It did, however, spin off a number of copycat games that are going to be resurgent later, used by Sega, such as Sewer Shark and Night Trap on the Sega Mega CD. Now, these games, of course, were quite appalling and were not very entertaining because they lack the same functionality as other video games, but they did demonstrate, importantly, the appeal of interactive drama, in which we have a form of multiple choice video sequences that are going to pop up. An extreme example of video games this time, which is part of the difficult but fair genre, would be the Ghosts and Goblins Capcom put out in 1985. Now, Fujiwara is going to be the designer for this game, where you play King Arthur in a two-dimensional platformer rescuing the maid Guinevere. Now, it is built around the precision of mastering trajectories of jumping, which you have quite a limited ability to do, and throwing very unusual weapons like swords and axes, etc. It is very different from other games like it, which would side scroll left to right as you progress, because enemies would come from left and right, birds would swoop down, coffins would rise from the ground, and all manner of hordes would descend upon you. The difficulty in this game, which of course anyone who's played it can tell you they almost never get past the first level, is going to belie the cute cartoony style in which it's going to be designed, whereby if you're hit once, your armor is gone, revealing your hearts on boxer shorts, and 2 hits, you turn to a pile of bones. It is precise, it is brutal, and it is impossible to resist, and it inspired many later games in this genre of knights battling ghosts and goblins. Now, there's also another trend at the time towards multiplayer games, and many of these become classics, such as Gauntlet. Ed Logg is going to be the designer here, and in 1985 produces his 4-player game by Atari. It is a top-down dungeon battler where you have 4 characters with different abilities, much like Dungeons and Dragons. You have a wizard, a warrior, an elf, and a Valkyrie. Now, you could use all of these characters to work together, for instance, to survive, or you could hoard all of the food yourself and become enemies with them, just like you can do with Dungeons and Dragons. Finally, we'll look at 2 arguably racing games before finishing the lecture. The first is Yu Suzuki's Outrun, produced by Sega in 1986, which was the high point of the golden age of arcades because it was a technical showcase. It relied on sprite scaling, in which individual sprites, or the objects on screen, would grow larger, thus creating a sense of rapid movement. And it's the first one to do this at such fast, brilliant speed. Now, there are 15 possible routes one can take in Outrun, and it's organized brilliantly again into a pyramid that flows out from a starting point. Each player can select either to go left or right. The left option is always going to be easier, as seen in the right-hand image here on the screen. It is a fantasy game whereby you drive a Ferrari while sitting in a replica of a Ferrari that speeds through hyper-picturesque visions of global landmarks and Americana. Thus, of course, it received widespread acclaim, and we now have an infinite number of spin-offs whereby you have driving games with a replica of what you're driving there. Everything from helicopters to tanks to cars to motorcycles. However, arguably the ultimate game to come out of this age, the golden age of arcades, was designed by Koshiro and was called Space Harrier of 1985, summing up the surrealism of the 1980s. For it is a blisteringly fast game whereby we find things are hurled forward at your avatar. Well, everything from Chinese-style dragons, boulders as you see here, giant heads as you see in the upper corner here, alien octopi, psychedelic flies, jet helicopters, and random bits of geometry. Now, the game really is not about racing, but instead about dodging all of these fast-paced sprites that are flying at you. So here we see the premium cabinet that it originally came in, complete with a flight stick and surround sound. And so this really sums up what arcades were all about and what they could do. A single cabinet dedicated to this type of quality, one-off experience with high-resolution graphics. Now, this, of course, is a doomed art form at the time because it's too complex and expensive to keep up. And so just like Laserdisc, this is the last great hurrah for this type of racing game. Next class, we will continue on with the rebound of the industry after the great video game crash of 1983 with the rise of Nintendo.